complicated, you know, man. It's like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like,
If you share my lack of faith in our health system, you should take control of your well-being. Building resilience and maintaining good health for the long term needs to be a priority. Axios Remote Fitness Coaching offers one-stop expert advice on training, diet, and lifestyle. You can purchase customized workout plans for strength training or structured exercise. If you're serious about maximizing your potential, you can book time with a coach or customize your routine and get video feedback on your performance. I know the owner, and he's one of us. Visit Axios and support those who support the show. Follow the link in the description to become a man of action with Axios. No one blames you for being weak, but it's your fault if you stay that way. All right, Liquid Swan, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well. So before we get into it, could you describe to my audience kind of who you are and what you do?
I'm let's call myself a middle class sensible centerist. I'm a family guy. I have 3 kids. I have a wife. I do writing for Praxarchy on the side. Normally, I'm a trades guy. Do electroplating and surface finishing, which is basically polishing metal and putting attaching like zinc or whatever to the substrate of different metals to avoid corrosion. Otherwise, yeah, I've been writing for the last couple of years for Praxarchy. I might be starting up with this secondary Substack called the Red Ensign. Black Horse, if you know him, he's heading that with a bunch of other Canadians to sort of highlight. Canada's not like 100% cuckolded, but so just to sort of to highlight things. I'm kind of on the black pill end of that spectrum, but I'm gonna give her a whirl.
Well, fair enough. I've heard, black pill or not black pill. Damn it, sorry. I can't think and speak at the same time. But I've heard Black Horse, mention that before, and he's a good friend of the channel, so I'll be sure to check that out. So you mentioned that you're a trades guy. You work a real job, so to speak. So I'm curious, how did you get into writing? Because that's not super common as far as writers in our sphere.
Well, when I was kind of destined to go to university, but I had a kid when I was 18. So I kind of was like, well, I just got to make this kid's life right. So I started working. And that put me into various crappy jobs when I was younger, including security and whatnot. But then I was reading the paper when I was working my crappy security job, and I found a job for a carpenters union. So, I was at the time, I would probably style myself as like a default leftist. And so I joined the union, and then I got working in the carpentry trade. And then another job came up which I'm in now, and so I've been working there for about 14 years. Prior to that, during this time, all this crap started happening with the SJW stuff, and like it kind of culminated with, in Canada, almost everyone's like default leftist. But I've always had sort of traditional. I've been sort of predisposed to traditionalism, like the traditional lifestyle of like a guy goes out to work, earns money for the family, and the mom stays home, sort of thing. And all this crazy stuff with the left started pushing me away from that, and I started kind of exploring other ideas. And when I started talking to people more on the right, which, by the way, there's almost none here in Canada, so it's hard to even get exposed to it. When I started talking to Americans, I started realizing, oh wow, the right wing American guys are a lot nicer. Like they're a lot kinder. They're reasonable. They argue logically. They're not hateful of like different ideas. So I started moving more towards the right, and then the more I read about it, I became sort of closer and closer tied to, say, a traditional model. And eventually, what happened was on Facebook. When I had Facebook, I don't have it anymore. A friend of mine announced that their son is trans, and he was 5 years old. And I was like, that's enough of this. So I quit Facebook. Kind of that was like the last nail in the coffin for me. Oh, also, I read the Road to Serfdom because I became exposed to this guy who was a fan of Hop and Mises and Hayek. So I read the Road to Serfdom, and that was the final nail in the coffin for any idea of like even some sort of like government programs for people. I was just like, well, this is just crap. But it took a while because you just don't get exposed to here. Everyone just sort of is leftist. Even the conservatives here are very leftist. I have nothing but criticism for the conservatives in Canada.
So I'm not going to pretend that I have some deep understanding of Canadian politics, right? I think that to me, I became primarily aware of kind of Trudeau as this like boogeyman figure, because at least in, kind of right wing American circles, there is always this idea, and it's not expressed in the most sophisticated way, but it's basically this idea that like, oh, like Canada's just 10, 15 years ahead of us. Because there's an odd relationship, and I don't mean to say this in any insulting way at all, right? That's not
Mm.
what. But in a weird way, Canada, it feels like a lot of Canadian political stances are in reaction to Red America, right?
Yes, yes. Oh, it's cancer.
So essentially, there's this, and I think that the perfect example of this is Trudeau's big, like gun legislation that went through, banning a whole bunch of different guns, because by and large, right, Canada does not have a violent crime problem, at least anywhere comparable to the U.S., right?
The only violent crime we have is basically like immigrant gangs in like Toronto and sometimes Vancouver. That's like the only maybe Montreal, but the three big cities. There's immigrant gangs, and they cause all these problems, and they usually keep to themselves. So the gun legislation didn't make any sense from a Canadian perspective. They're
But
basically just yeah.
it makes a whole lot of sense if your goal is to essentially dunk on American conservatives, and be what America should be like super California. And so to me, that I kind of became aware of it because do you remember like right when Trudeau got elected, he kind of became the darling of like the Tumblr left when that was still a force. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, I remember.
And there was all these like really weird, like, future millennial cat ladies, at the time in their mid 20s making like Justin Trudeau fan fiction and like Justin Trudeau body pillows, like super nerdy, weird internet stuff. But that was kind of
Oh
the first
man,
moment I was like, who the hell is this guy?
that's why I started my Exodus article with "Is current year plus 8" because that was 2015 and it's 2023 now, and it's
I love that one.
something changed, you know.
Yeah, it sure did. So I'm curious, right? And you mentioned you're more on, the black pilled end of the spectrum when it comes to
for, for for
Canada.
for Canada, yeah.
Is that basically just because like that the whole, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I'm just guessing here, but is it because that whole political apparatus is completely and totally captured? Like even the
It's
conservatives are essentially cucked.
the conservatives are basically they're like a doorstop, but all the other force is pushing against the door. So they're just sort of squishing the doorstop into like the space between the door and like the door frame. And so there's like a little bit of air there to breathe, but there's nothing really pushing back against it. And there's a lot of problems. Like we have the first we have the problem of we're living on technically we're occupying native land because we made these treaties with them a long time ago, and they don't like to we don't like to break them here apparently. And so there's that. So there's the native issue, which is there's some legitimate problems that the natives suffered, but I mean like it's kind of I think it's overblown. So there's that problem. And then the other problem is the mass immigration. We just have like they say 500,000 a year, but it's more like a million because they drag their families along. So a million people in Canada is a lot. That's like a whole new, Edmonton basically every year, um, which is the capital of Alberta. And then you add in say like this pressure that the left feels here to I don't know try to make wins against Republicans in the states for no reason, even though it's not even the same country. Like the Trump derangement syndrome here is maybe even worse than down south. Everyone, unless they're a reasonable person, which is very few, is absolutely deranged about that. And also, there's just less development here, and it's cold, and there's like less nice places to live. So everyone's sort of crowded around the border. So that's just going to get denser and denser. Um, I bet you eventually you'll spill over to the states from the north end too, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably right. So I became, and I don't even want to think about that. Like we're all, I mean, I'll put it this way. I don't want to speak too directly, but I think that you and I are probably about similar when it comes to our outlook on the future of our countries, I guess, respectively. So I became aware of your work through friends of the channel, the guys over at Longhouse, right? They had you on, and
Mhm.
you work with Ludic Path over at Praxarchy, and you specifically were talking about an article you wrote called Exodus. And I read the article. It was an interesting article. I, heard you speak about it, but it's something that I want to address, on stream. So if you could you give like a thumbnail sketch, an outline of your position in that article?
My position is basically that I think it's great to put up a fight on the home soil. So people in Europe should stand and try to maintain their culture. I'm talking about dissident right people that want to maintain the traditions. However, it's a big fight. You could lose. So maybe would be a good idea to have a backup plan. It sort of fits with the Faustian spirit to expand into the spaces that aren't occupied. That's basically how Canada, the United States were formed. That's how much of Europe was formed. So taking that extra step wouldn't be beyond our sort of cultural spirit, but I do understand that we need to sort of support and keep up the fight in the homelands, but we should think of a backup plan. And so I suggested in that article 3 places: Polynesia, Eastern Siberia, or sort of the Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina border in the south. And my conclusion is that the south of Brazil would be the best, but that's open to debate, obviously.
It's interesting because, and I'll put this out there. I am, and I don't mean this in the National Socialist context, but I'm very much a blood and soil type of guy. In the sense that I mean, like, I don't know what I would be outside of the place that I live. It's kind of sunk into my bones. And I think that that's pretty common among American Southerners.
Hmm.
So when I read your article at first, I was like, what is this bullshit? Like, I don't, I have no time for this. And then, somewhat uncomfortably, I read through it and I was like, oh, you have a point. And you have a really interesting point. And I think that what kind of got to me is I had this mental experiment. It was like, okay, like the idea of like humanity expanding into the stars is an interesting one to me. Like that's something that like, wow, that seems like a noble goal. And then there was kind of this little mind in the back, or like little voice in the back of my mind that basically said like, well, you'd go to space, but you wouldn't go to Brazil. Like really, like you think you're brave enough to do it. And I think it's a valid point, right? Which is that if we do as a civilization have this kind of like Faustian desire to expand, to go elsewhere and to build something, I think that you make a compelling point there that like maybe that same instinct that enabled us to build, the new world, which is kind of crumbling around us. Like what's to prevent us from doing it again? And to me, I don't know. It was a particularly like evocative question because I'd never really thought about it in that way. Again, like I don't think it's for me, but you put forth kind of an interesting, I guess like an interesting argument. And I think the thing that had me kind of thinking about this even before your article is, I noticed the same thing that everyone else did, with the World Cup.
Hmm.
You look at the French team and you look at the Argentinian team, right? And if you just took the jerseys off and asked, okay, which one's which,
Yeah,
you'd be 100% wrong, right?
yeah.
And it does kind of seem like, and I don't want to take up all the air in the room here, but it does kind of seem like it's going to be harder and harder to have our values in the places we are from, So, maybe going to a place where you are not an enemy, but you're an asset, is something that I guess
It's a
might be worth
bonus.
pursuing. Yeah.
It's
So
less pressure, right? Because the pressure's on your side rather than against you.
right, yeah, exactly. You're pushing into an open door. So you mentioned multiple different locations, and I'm curious. I know you settled on kind of like South Brazil, but why were those the three locations that sprang to mind, and why was Brazil ultimately the one you landed on?
Well, Eastern Siberia is okay. It has lots of resources, but it's a harsher climate. It's definitely not as comfortable. So there are some arguments for that itself being a bonus because it forces like harsh Darwinian selection. But do you want your kids to be like living in igloos and not igloos, but like uh, what do they call that down there? Sort of like the wooded area, the Tunguska or whatever. Um, do you want your children growing up in that area? They're going to be completely away from a large swath of technology anyway. It's not that technology is all good, but and you're also way isolated, so there's no real access to hospitals and whatever. You're going to need surgeries, and we're a group like ours is not going to have surgeons immediately, most likely, because why would you do that when you could make $1 million a year doing surgery or whatever in the States? So it's true that there's going to be a lot less pressure for other people to live there, but it's also sort of the Chinese Lebensraum, which is also kind of a thing you want to kind of avoid that because you know they have a certain way of living, and it might not be congruent with what we want. But I mean, if you took away the Chinese pressure, you took away the complete and utter isolation, which has its benefits, but there are costs to that. Then maybe it would be okay. But then you have to add in also that it's in Russia, and that's going to have a certain pressure on it from the West right away. So you might end up isolating yourselves completely from your families, and that's going to be more difficult for people to make the journey and then remain. And and as for Polynesia, there's a couple of good things with Polynesia. It's isolated. You have access to the sea. You can have your technological comforts to some degree or another, whatever limitations a community like ours would put on that, who knows? But the locals are not really welcoming to permanent uh, visitors. They want visitors, not immigrants. Um, so that, they can get quite violent. So there's that. But there might be isolated places. But it's also very small. No one cares about it. So the main thing is that if you're going through a collapse, what you kind of want to have is you want to have a place where no one's going to care that you're there. You still have access to some sort of, say, economic benefits, like, for example, I said with East Asia, Siberia, you have like access to lots of resources from the forests. Um, Polynesia, you have access to the ocean, maybe shipping routes. Brazil, though, you have access to like fertile land, rivers, and if you're on that tri border, you kind of have a bonus there because you can kind of just cross and go back, and you don't have to worry about border guards once you establish because you kind of control that spot. And it's in the hinterlands; no one cares. There's maybe a couple thousand people that live in the very southern tip of Brazil, and almost everyone in Uruguay lives in Montevideo, and almost everyone in Argentina lives in Cordoba, between Cordoba and La Plata. In Buenos Aires. So I mean, you're kind of in an area where there's less people, lots of resources, friendly people, and it's cheap. I mean, all the areas are cheap except for maybe Polynesia, but Brazil's cheap for what you get.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I guess, like an interesting thought experiment. If nothing else, right? Like, what are
Yeah,
your kind of like rank ordered choices, right? And obviously, like being away from kind of like the Eye of Sauron is a big plus, right?
yeah,
And I think what we've seen the impossibility of escaping the Eye of Sauron inside the continental US, right? I mean, obviously, like you can live in an Uncle Ted cabin for a while, but guess what? Uncle Ted doesn't still live in the cabin.
yeah,
They got him.
yeah,
And there are kind of like innumerable other, examples. So you're like, all right, well, we have everywhere else, and it's kind of like, to me, like, have you ever seen those like nuclear maps of the world? Where it's basically like these are the places where nukes would drop. Who knows how realistic they are?
yeah,
But you kind of have that thought experiment, like, okay, well, like, where am I away from, the eye? where am I away from the conflict? And so it is, I guess, like an interesting, I guess, like what your priorities are.
Yeah.
And I know that you've mentioned before in other appearances that your wife is Brazilian, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So what is it like in Brazil for, shall we say, just like, like white Westerners?
It's like you're a god. Basically, you're like a what? So let's say here's what my wife said. So, um, I have blue eyes. Uh, I'm very pale because that's my family line, and I have brown hair, light brown hair. So, and I'm tall. So in Brazil, if I was a 5 out of 10, you had the tallness, you had the blue paleness, you had the blue eyes. That's now I'm 8 out of 10 in Brazil. So it's a lot friendlier to just automatically, and that's just off the top. Like if you're just if you're a friendly guy, you're gonna get you'll be more appreciated, let's say. But you don't really get that in the West because, well, everyone a lot of people are like that, and two, there's a lot of this sort of official pressure against your sort of existence in some ways, you know. So, but I mean, you have to be careful though, because there are criminals. They look a certain type, and but so you have to be careful about that. But you can avoid it because there's sort of enclaves even in the big cities where you will come across these. There are enclaves of people like me there that are sort of protected by walls. Now, my suggestion is not to go in those areas, and that would be more like Sao Paulo, which isn't so bad, but it has its problems. Rio de Janeiro and anywhere north of that, that's going to be really bad. But if you go south of that, really the atmosphere is not much different than, say, Italy or maybe southern Germany. It's like walking through Europe in a lot of the cities.
So I've spoken to a series of Brazilian guys.
Hmm.
I spoke to Cato, who's appeared, on a couple different, like public forums, talking about the political issues in Brazil. But it's
Yeah.
actually what he said. He's a an upper class Brazilian guy, and it's funny because I was lucky enough to spend some time in South America recently. My dad was an expat for a long time, and so after I finished up university, he basically was like, "All right, like let's hang out for a little bit."
Mm-hmm.
And we went to, obviously, very different country, but we went to Peru for a few weeks. And what you said about being treated like a god, I was kind of unprepared for it because, like, Peru
Yeah.
is one of the shortest countries in the world. And, like, I'm not a huge guy, but I'm like, 175, athletically built, 6 foot tall, like, and I felt like I was in daycare. And that's just one
Yeah.
part of it. But like, it reminded me, like, have you ever seen in like old, kind of like pulp movies or books, right? The image of like the pith helmeted explorer, being kind of
Yeah.
like carried around on people's shoulders.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
obviously there's a little bit of hyperbole, but it's not that far off. And if you're not expecting it, it's a little bit disconcerting.
And everyone
where
wants
you're
to everyone wants to talk to you too. They're like, "Oh, I want to practice my English." That's one thing, and they just want to hear what it's like in the free world. They call it.
Yeah, and it's if you haven't experienced it, and I hadn't before, it was very odd.
Yeah, it's a very my first experience with that actually was when I was 17. I took a school trip to Russia, and the chicks there were like absolutely unbelievable. Like, it's like there was no one less than a 5 out of 10, I'll say, and most of them were like 7. So there are benefits. I think there's a reason why, like, there's like that conquistador sort of uh, motif,
Right. And I think that a lot of a lot of us on a lot of us on the right have a stated versus revealed preference problem, right? Where we
Yeah,
say we want out of the system. We say we want to be out from, the GAE. But the problem is we don't want to make the sacrifices associated with that. And right, if I could wave a magic wand and keep all of the standard of living and keep all of the comfort associated with our current regime, but get rid of the parts I didn't like, yeah, of course I'd do that, right? But that's not at least from my perspective, that's not a realistic option. I
Well,
don't see there being a win button.
let me warm your butter there. So, when you go to Brazil, like the food prices are much lower than here. The housing prices like are unbelievably low. Like if you get a piece of land, put $50,000 into it, you have a palatial mansion. Depending where you are, but most places. So and cars are cheaper. There is a lot of problems with bureaucracy. That is like the biggest pain in the neck ever, even worse than Canada, believe it or not. In many cases, not all cases, but many cases. But there's also some they're a little bit looser on some laws too, and you can hand a guy a couple reais and he'll let something go, and you can work your way through the bureaucracy a lot more smoothly than maybe officially on paper. So there are like if you take your wealth from wherever you are, if you're in the West and you go to southern Brazil with it, uh, if you play your cards right, you can start a business and you'll be living like a king. You'll be living like a sort of upper middle class person. If you're a lower middle class, you'll be upper middle class in Brazil. So, but you have to play your cards right. It's a risk too because you could fail, and that's tough for people. And yeah.
And I think we're pointing the same direction here, which is like, look, like this is not a risk-free option. In addition to the economic risk, there's a social risk, but at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not in a situation where we have great options, so to speak. We're not in a situation where it's just, well, if we just vote, it'll all go back to normal. We can set the time back. And so I think that it's appropriate to kind of take a grim look at the situation we're in, and be like, all right, like you can stay, but you got to understand what that means. Or on the other hand, you can leave, but you've got to understand what that means. And I think that there's a lot of kind of like wishful thinking, so to speak, of essentially believing that like, oh, we can turn America into based world, and like, all right, I hope I'm wrong. You know what? If we do it, great. I'll look like an idiot. I'll have egg on my face, but I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
And
well,
I think that the reason that I found, this concept at least like it piqued my interest is that basically like it is assuming, I guess, that kind of like second option, like you said, like it's good to fight. It's good to make a run of it, but maybe don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, well, that's why I say with staying, you kind of, if everyone stays in the West and we get slowly consumed over the generations by the woke mind virus and whatever you want to call it, kind of cringe using that word. But if everyone stays and does that, and we slowly get devoured. Is that a win? So in such a case, you want to have at least someone carry the torch. As Spengler said, he thinks it's Russia, but someone's got to carry that torch of civilization to the next round, let's say. And I don't think it's gonna. I think we're gonna end up being like Magians here because that's who we're important. And yeah.
So Charlie in chat saying, how many people can actually take a risk this big? I think these ideas always fall flat on that. Fair enough, right? It is a big risk. So there were two things, which is one, Charlie, I know a little bit about your personal details. I believe you have taken, a big risk like that. You've moved yourself, and I guess you've been, upfront about that. But I think that what we've seen before, because obviously after our own the war between the states, right? Multiple populations basically set out, and not all wealthy people basically set out from a lost conflict. Many of them went into Mexico, or what would become Texas. Many of them went to Brazil, and admittedly not all successfully. Like I think roughly 2/3 returned. But I'm saying that this is something that has been done often. And especially in the New World, as descendants of people who essentially like gave it a shot, it's at least an option.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a number of I think almost all of my great grandparents, except for three, immigrated to the New World from Europe. But the three that were here before that, they were probably here for like just less than 10 generations altogether. So I mean, it's not like in our history we haven't done stuff like this, and it's not like it's ever been hard. It's not like it was easier back then. I know of some of my Dutch ancestors. They took a wooden sailing ship across the ocean and stopped in Halifax, and then went all the way to Oregon. So I mean, that's not easy back then, especially compared to how it is now. Nowadays, you can liquidate all your assets, put them into some, say a bank, like international bank, like HSBC, and that transfers between countries. Put it all in the bank, buy your plane tickets. You're there in like a day or two, and then you can go buy some property at a real estate agent. You don't have to go hunting around for months and months and months, right? So it is easier, but it's a risk because if you screw up, that's basically it. Maybe your family back home will be able to bail you back out, but you have to plan. You have to aim your shot, and you have to take it. And I agree with Charlemagne. How many people can afford to do such a thing? I mean, more than you think, but you only need about 150 people total to keep a population stable for a long, long time. But the idea would be have 100. You grow up to 150 at least, then grow from there to keep it going. But it's doable.
And I think also, if current trends continue, right, and conditions get worse, it will become a more appealing option. You know,
Mm.
And like I said, like I said this before we went live, like things now aren't really that bad. Obviously, like we're seeing a decrease in living standard. You and I were complaining before this about how expensive housing is for much of the North American continent, for much of the West as a whole.
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah, that's bad. Things could definitely get worse, and I think that as that the benefits to staying decrease, I think we'll see more people. It's simple economic incentive, right?
Yeah. But and
So
also,
you,
I think if we can, one thing I would suggest, rather than thinking of it as like oh, we're gonna plan for next week or in the next 2 years, it's sort of got to be. I think a better idea would be sort of come up with an idea, like a framework for someone to work within, and then when the moment of what they call the moment of action happens, there's sort of a pre-made sort of structure for them to fit themselves into, if that makes sense.
hmm.
I
And
was
I
just
think
reading about
that's
this. Sorry, I was just reading about this town in Brazil. Actually, it's in the Rio de Janeiro state. It was founded by one Finnish guy, and he came across because he had a dream or something like that, and he came across and started building this farm. And then he got another 250 of his fellow Finns to come over after he wrote a book about it, like a couple of years later. So he and that town's still there, and they still do Finnish festivals and stuff like that. A place like this all over Brazil.
well, and that's obviously there's infamously there's kind of like German settlements all across South America. There's the Confederados, right? Like this has been done before. And again, like I said, like I'm probably not the man to do it, but it is an idea that has kind of captured my imagination. But
Yeah.
to kind of pivot slightly, you wrote another article. These are two of your articles on Praxarchy that I read that I quite enjoyed. And it's a shorter article. It's called Interregnum.
Yeah.
And if you could you describe again like the framework of that? I'll let you use your own words instead of me trying to do it.
Well, I'll try to make it synopsize it here. Basically, it's the idea that democracy is actually a form of interregnum. And what I mean by that is that, well, I mean, literally in the language, regnum means rule by a king, or at least rule with law and order. And I see democracy as like a uh, devolution or a falling apart of law and order. And that democracy is not really a form of government. What it is that period in between when you have a government and you have another government. So a lot of people, the way the West looks at things, they always look at it democratic centric. So if you look at Rome through a say Western democratic lens, you see the empire as the fall of Rome, or as the empire is the dissolution of the Roman idea. But I think the republic was actually the dissolution of the Roman idea. You have the kingdom of Rome first, and then you get a corrupt king, and that happens. So they get rid of him, but then they institute the republic over a small period of time, but it basically happened almost right away on a historical scale. And then that leads to the corruption and degradation that always happens under democracies or republics. I call them how they word it, indefinitive systems. So with a king, you have a definitive system. If a king messes up, you chop his head off, or you have someone to blame for the problem. So consequences happen, and then maybe you have a new king, and he has to do a good job, or he gets his head lopped off as well. But when you have an indefinitive system, you have like a democracy. You get like guys, you get like middle school drama teachers for prime ministers. They're in for 4 to 12 years. They buy and sell you like they buy and sell you like the market at New Orleans, and then your country goes to crap. And I found from my reading of history, anyways, that democracy isn't a sign of enlightenment or a sign of growth. It's more of a sign of decline. So that's basically my main argument.
That's well put. It reminds me very much of Curtis Yarvin's of Moldbug's point about formalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And his idea was essentially like, well, far from increasing accountability, far from making it easier for the normal person to control power, democracy is a great obfuscation. Like you said before,
Mm-hmm.
like when it's clear who's in charge, when it's either formalized or when it's definite, to use your language, then
Mm-hmm.
who is making the choices, who is to blame for it. But when it's this like massive gray apparatus, when it's this, just kind of like behemoth, this like faceless mass that, decrees just seem to like emanate from no particular place. It's never written into a law. It's just happens. It's incredibly difficult to to actually assign blame for anything. And I think that in a weird way, obviously the idea of chopping the king's head off, sometimes that was a peasant's revolt, but oftentimes it was like internecine elites, they're like, oh, the king would someone would poison the king's food, and bada bing, bada boom, it's now, his second cousin, or something like that.
Yeah.
Because again, like he was not ruling well, or he couldn't keep a grip on power. I'm not necessarily, I don't think you are either, kind of like playing into this kind of like delusion of, like medieval revolutions. But yet again, like I think that in a weird way, it almost, in addition to retarding the ability of normal people to assign blame, it almost like retards the abilities of elites to kind of knock each other off, to kind of get rid of the top guy on the totem, because there is no top guy on the totem, at least from my perspective.
Yeah. And well, I've seen some comments in there talking about the chopping the king heads off. I wasn't really, as you mentioned, I wasn't really meaning like you actually have that happen often. As you said, it's more like the power struggle of the elites, sort of removing the mandate of heaven from whoever is ruling at the moment, and then instituting their mandate. So, but with democracy, you never get that. Like your vote, like what's your vote matter? Like one guy, you go vote. How much power do you get from that? And on top of that, you got your rights, your Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or your Constitution of the states. What is just a piece of paper? It's like, okay, in Canada, it's basically, as I wrote in the article, it's like a piece of paper. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is supposed to give you, it's supposed to be the most freeing document in the world history. Like even more, it's supposed to make you more free than the Americans. But then you look at Canada, and it's not. So what I see it as is, they can put all the rights on a piece of paper so that the judge can just crumple them up and throw them in the trash in one fell swoop.
And I think that is, I guess, one of the primary, I guess, like lies that we have to kind of own up to as, essentially like post-Enlightenment Westerners, is the lie of the Constitution. The lie of the idea that merely by putting, noble intentions to paper, you can limit power. Because, what you said earlier about, kind of the third world, which on paper you are less free, right? Like if you actually just looked at the laws themselves, you'd think like, oh, you'd want to live in the well-run country, the country with an efficient bureaucracy with clear laws. But in actuality, right, if you just want to be left alone, what's easier? To carve out your little niche in between all the laws, the ever expanding bureaucracy always kind of like looking to bring you into the total state, you know, or some guy who you slip $50 to just leave you alone.
Exactly, because you can always get more $50.
Exactly. And my point is not saying like, wow, based corruption, but it's kind of my point. It's kind of this idea that the format of freedom we have been sold is not freedom. That just because it says on paper I'm free has absolutely like it has no more bearing on material reality than if you and I wrote a constitution right now and said, well, that's the law of the land. And
Yeah, because
again, like
all legitimate authority comes from force and violence. It doesn't come from a piece of paper. And if you're soft or weakened or small, you're unable to foment the violence necessary to enforce the paper. So, but if you had the violence in the first place, you wouldn't need the paper. So what's it matter? The paper's just paper, you know?
and I think that it's particularly hard because being on the right, we have this attachment to our cultural icons and our cultural like touchstones, so to speak, right? Like we want to be the traditionalist, not the iconoclast. But I think that we have to be pretty honest about why we're here, and the fact that we are here. And don't get me wrong, some of that's exogenous. Some of that is other people coming in and making it worse. But they didn't arrive here on a spaceship. We did this to ourselves. Maybe not all of it, but a good bit of it. And I think we also have to be honest about the fact that, like, many of the things that we hold dear and we're taught to hold dear, well, they lined us up for that. And I guess to me, like, that I understand you can never really shed your cultural icons. Like Rome always had the Senate, even even when it was, painfully obvious it wasn't really a functional body. It always had it though. And I think that in the US you'll always have the Constitution. You'll always have that, that language. But to me, and this is why, hearing about, the idea of exiting or hearing about these other ideas are interesting, because I think that what kind of unites us across the DR is basically this idea of like we're casting around for solutions. We're looking for a way to get out of this one way or another. And I think that the solution of like, oh, well, we just need to do the Constitution harder, or do, 1776 shall commence again. Like, to me, it's ghost dancing. It's something that makes you feel good, but it's not exactly a productive outcome. And sorry, man, I've been talking for probably 10 minutes now, but I'll throw it back to you.
Well, I in a previous set of articles I wrote on Praxarchy, I called it the Authoring Caesar series. It was about 4 articles there. And one of them I talk about the how long the West has been in decline. And so what would your guess be? Like if you had to put a year on it, when would you say the West hit its peak?
That's a hard one.
It's
Probably,
subjective.
probably. I would say Louis the 13th.
Louis the 13th. Okay. I would say, to some degree, I would agree with that actually. But I had to take in some other things into account. So my accounting of it was say 1867, and I looked at that year because there's a number of things that happened that really showed a flip, like a switch being flipped. And a lot of times people talk about, okay, it's a political moment. I noticed you just say Louis the 13th. My reference point actually is the first public performance of the Blue Danube by Johann Strauss II in Vienna at the Diana Baths. That's when I think it. That's when I said it. And if you look at say the British Empire during that time, Queen Victoria had been on the throne for quite a while. I think her husband had died just a couple years before. But from that point of her husband's death, she basically was just a dowager queen, doing nothing. The empire basically ran on fumes from that point forward until basically World War I dismantled it. And also in 1867 for me, that's when Canada became a country. So I say it was killed in the crib because it was part of the empire, and now it's just, well, look at it now, you know.
So, and I will say, I stole that answer from Paul Fahrenheit,
Mm.
and I think that there's a point to that, but I think that from an American context, I would say 1865, uh,
Okay.
for
Uh,
for
yeah, yeah,
reasons that should become obvious.
It's funny how it
Um,
all lines up, though, kind of in some sense.
no, I know, and I think that I think the thing that is tragic in all of this, is it does kind of feel like drowning in a bathtub. Like if you could just get someone to stand up. And there's
Yeah.
obviously a degree of sadness, you know? But I think that, and this is something that I've gotten from Demaistre, is this idea that like there's really only one way to get rid of corruption. And that's essentially to burn it out. And that's not a fun process. That's not a painful process. And things are lost to the fire, so to speak.
It's funny because
But
I was gonna say, I was just actually thinking in my head when you said the bathtub thing. I was thinking, well, imagine if you woke up from a coma and your house is on fire. Like you're in a coma in your house for some reason, and you woke up and everything's on fire. What's the first thing you do?
I mean, stand up, I guess, but yeah.
Get the hell
Or I
out of
guess
the
get in
house,
that.
right?
Yeah. And again, like I think that, and this is a broader, theme going through all of this, for me at least, is that like there's a desire to save everything, when you're running out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the choice you're given. The fire doesn't wait for you. The fire the fire isn't considerate. It is something outside of you.
Yeah, the
And
fire
I
rises.
think, yeah, exactly. And like there comes a point at which like you can't run back in. The flames run too high, and either you go back in for grandma's picture album and you get burnt up too, or you cut your losses. And I'm not one to say like, oh, here's the time. But I think it probably bears considering that, if people like you and I are serious about our like diagnosis of the system, we think that this thing is not headed in a good direction. Like it's probably good to actually examine that as a premise and take it seriously.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just rambling, but it does
Well,
seem like there's a lot of desire to just wave a magic wand and have it all be good again.
that's like the boomer delusion, and in some sense that everything will just get better if we just keep hoping and praying. But when you mentioned that you can't go back into the burning building thing, it kind of reminded me of the story of when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and they look back and they can't go back in because it's like guarded by the flaming swords or whatever. Um, it kind of reminds you, once you get out of the fire, you can't really go back. You have to move forward. You have to become something new. You're in the world now. You're in the great game, and the past is behind you.
Yeah, and I think that that's why the distinction between conservatives and reactionaries isn't the best term, but what I would consider people who are right wing and people who are conservative, that's often synonymous. But I think that there's a difference in temperament,
Hmm.
because when I consider, and I use reactionary more in the the NRX sense of that word, not in a literal someone who
Yeah,
reacts, right?
yeah,
But when I consider the difference between that and a conservative, like from a 60,000 foot view, that seems like the same thing, right? Anti-left. I don't like that. I want to
well, actually,
return to a more traditional.
I see conservatives sort of just as liberals. I don't see them. I conceptualize them as liberals now, because like they sort of basically agree on almost everything, but at what speed they go.
Well, and it's kind of like it's like a hardware backup. That they are
Yeah,
operating off of like version 1.1 instead of version 1.3.
yeah,
But it's the same thing. It's the same box. And so the point I wanted to make is essentially this idea that like the you being in this kind of weird position of having a respect for the past, a respect for tradition, like you mentioned, at the start of this, but realizing that simply like putting your head down and doing the thing you're supposed to do isn't the way out of this. That you're going to have to examine, I guess, other options, and uncomfortable options is something that I think is, I don't know, exciting and unique and a little bit grim, kind of all at once.
Well, a lot of my European ancestors, like they did that. They examined the situation where they were in, say, the Netherlands, and Sweden, and I think parts of Scotland, and they were saying, "Well, there's not enough food here, and life kind of sucks. So I'm gonna get on a wooden sailing ship and sail to the other side of the earth and start anew." So I mean, if you got to think about how bad things got to get, like your family's been in Europe for, well, your entire lineage is history, and you're going to be the guy that travels across the ocean on the big wooden boat. It's like there's got to be some pressure there. So I don't know if we're there yet, as you mentioned, but I'm trying to get like early in to get people thinking about it.
Yeah, and again, like I I love my home. Like I love where I am from, and who I am is tied up in that. Like
Yeah,
and so it's not something you should approach lightly. But to me, it reminds me of the Iliad, right? Where Troy is sacked, Troy is fallen, and well, what do? Well, you put your household gods in a sack. You take your father, you pick him up, and you go start something new. You take the past with you, right?
hmm
But there are a time, and this is, both in the classical tradition and the biblical one, where you got to go. And
yeah. Well, that's
you
the theory of Rome. One of the theories of Rome is that some Trojans founded it, essentially.
right, yeah, as as presented in the Iliad, right? I believe it's the Iliad or the Odyssey, the Iliad. I can't remember. I get all three of them mixed up because I'm not particularly intelligent. But anyway, man, yeah, exactly, right. That is the genesis of that, like world-spanning empire.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of running out of steam. I'm sorry about that, but I'm a little bit tired. So, if people want to find, more of their work, where can they check you out?
Well, I'm banned on Twitter right now, but you can still check it out. It's at Liquid Swan. I also have, and from there you can find my links, or you can go to praxarchy.com. And if you've seen one of my articles there, it's the newest one. There will be links to my profile, and that'll have links to my Substack, which is lordwallaceswan.substack.com. And that's all I'm doing for now. I do have a YouTube channel. We do like D&D 4th edition streams. I'm not like a big D&D guy. I just started doing it with some buddies, some base buddies from all around the world. And then I'm working with the Red Ensign. I haven't done an article for them yet, but it's with Black Horse, Geo, and a few others. I can't remember them all. There's like 10 of us all together. And that's going to be talking about Canada. I think they have a couple articles out already, so it's theredensign.substack.com. But other than that, oh, and the YouTube channel is just my name again, Liquid Swan.
And like I said, guys, I've really enjoyed his work, so you should check that out. If you want to hear more of him, as an audio format, just a few weeks ago he was on Longhouse, and
And you
obviously, oh yeah, I guess you were on UO as well.
Yeah.
I recommend both of those streams, wholeheartedly. As far as my stuff, obviously, you guys know where to find me. This is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Odyssey, as well as pretty much any other audio podcast platform you can think of. And we've been doing really well. I'm trying to push the audio show more and more, and I've been, really happy to see it grow. If you want to support the show, there are direct ways you can do that. All the normal, ways, and indirect ways, by checking out our sponsor. And we have kind of a special, I won't say sponsorship, but a special thing going on. And I mentioned this, in a couple other episodes, but George Bagby, who's appeared, multiple times on this stream, is a long-term friend and mentor of mine. He ended up losing his job. He got canceled. He got fired, for a pretty shitty reason. And so we've started a give, send, go to essentially give him a little bit of seed capital to start something else, to move to a new industry, to move to a new city, and get out from under this. We've connected with him, with the Exit Group and a couple other of those people, but money is required. Obviously, we don't expect it, but anything you want to throw over to Bagby, there is a link in the description and pinned in the chat to help him out. And again, thank you so much for coming out, man. I really appreciated talking to you.
Thanks for having me, man.
And remember, guys, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.